ran away, I think at 7 p.m. because they had to finish their drafts for today's ministerial meetings. So today we have a rather clear focus, and we're going to speak about one of the very critical parts when it comes to this discussion on climate finance, the identification of needs. The new collective goal on climate finance shall be based or should be based on the needs of developing countries, and the definition of these needs is everything but trivial. So today we want to dive into that. We want to look at the past years and discuss the challenges that countries and actors in the space have experienced in determining these needs, and then of course also in financing them. And then we want to also look ahead and talk about how, in the light of the very dire need to increase ambition, what we can learn from these past experiences on identifying and developing and then financing the needs to the years ahead. How are we organized today? We're going to have kind of two parts. It wouldn't be a copy event if there weren't many speakers, but I think the idea is really to have a very open conversation. So you're going to hear 3 short inputs from the speakers that I'm going to present in a second. Then we have a first time to ask questions and also raise comments from your side. And then we're going to have a second part with a panel, again, on these questions, again with 4 speakers. And we have, again, time for asking questions and the discussion between all of us. I hope that's fine for you. And with that, I want to get started. We will first hear from Abdulrasheed Issah. He's an economist and PhD candidate at ETHZ Zurich in the Energy and Technology Policy Group, and his research focuses on actually quantifying the specificity and scale of climate finance needs of developing countries to meet their climate goals. We will then hear an input from Louise Kessler. She's a program director at the Institute for Climate Economics, I4CE. She holds a PhD in climate economics and has joined I4CE in 2020, where she now oversees the applied research work on economic instruments and public policies, fostering the necessary investments for the low-carbon transition. And then we have Kachi. He is a senior policy analyst at the NewClimate Institute. His research focuses on principles and best practices in sustainable finance, currently with an emphasis on how finance sector interacts with energy and land use systems. His particular areas of interest and expertise include Paris-aligned investments and decision-making, multilateral development bank reforms, climate finance mobilization, and climate risk analysis. And with that, I want to give the microphone to Abdulrasheed. You have the pointer, please.
Cool. Can you hear me? Nice. Yeah, so let's get started. I'm sure anyone who is in this room or joining us online has heard a lot about climate finance, but what we try to do here is to kind of unpack this layer of climate finance and dig deeper into the granular details. And the motivation for doing this is when you hear about climate finance, we mostly talk about the aggregate flows from developed to developing countries, or we talk about the fair share of climate finance, which is all good, but then this removes us many layers away from getting into the meat of climate finance, specifically knowing what are the needs and priorities of developing countries, how do they change over time, and what kind of financing is needed to meet those needs. And to summarize this, I like to highlight this really nice quote from Axel van Trostenberg, who is from the World Bank. I know I can see his colleagues here laughing. And he was writing just ahead of COP27. He complained, I hope he was complaining. He said, when I follow up with governments and leaders on the status of their climate finance pledges, the answers too often lack specificity and concreteness to drive, to make real progress on the climate agenda. So to kind of directly engage with him, what we do in this paper is, okay, for us to know the needs and priorities of developing countries, we go to their NDCs and we try to see what these countries are asking in their NDCs, how much they quantify, what sectors are their priority sectors, what is for mitigation, adaptation, just to have kind of a big picture. So I will spare you the details on the methodology and all that, but simply we have this matrix here, if you can see, where we measure climate finance specificity, and by that we mean to what extent are countries able to quantify their climate finance needs, right? Because in finance, what gets measured gets financed, right? And here you can see we have adaptation on the horizontal axis and mitigation on the vertical axis. We have three categories: vague, low, and high. Vague means there is no estimate for adaptation or mitigation. Low means there is only an overall estimate for adaptation or mitigation. And high means in the NDC, so here we're talking with reference to NDC, there is at least sectoral estimate for adaptation or mitigation. So a country can be on this, you can't see the pointer, but the country at the bottom left means has no any estimate, which is vague, and the country at the top right corner means the country has at least sectoral estimates for adaptation and mitigation. Some countries go deeper to have even sub-sectoral estimates. So if you see here, and here I try to show only updated NDCs. We did this analysis for first and updated NDCs, and we have like 245 NDCs, and that took us months to do this data analysis. We first see substantial heterogeneity. African countries are more likely to put estimates into their NDCs. We don't see that much in South America. And just to say, the sample of countries here is only countries with conditional NDCs, right? And what we also find is that countries estimate mitigation much better than adaptation. And when we go a little deeper beyond mitigation or adaptation, we also see some interesting results. First is, what we try to show here is, so the charts, the pie charts we see here is that the darker it is, the more priority that sector is, and we see the first sector priority is usually energy, followed by WASH, and then agriculture and LCS. But what we find is specificity has increased across all sectors, so countries are getting better in estimating their needs, but still is much lower. And then we go to quantify how much do we have in terms of climate finance needs and NDCs, and what we find here is not much has changed, but we find interesting insights with respect to mitigation and adaptation. Estimates for mitigation has fallen, but adaptation has increased. We can talk more of the reason why. But another thing you could notice is conditional climate finance has increased, right? But unconditional has almost remained constant or reduced. So we can talk more about the reason for that. So to conclude, what we try to show here is that lack of specificity could lead to misunderstanding around allocation and tracking of climate finance, and it's important that we know what countries are asking. And second, it's also important to understand heterogeneities across countries and sectors and know how to design tools to mitigate that. And then the last one, we need really partnership, because estimating climate finance is not just task of public servant, but also the finance industry, civil society, and all that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Perfect timing, Abdulrasheed. And I hand over to Luis.
Thank you very much, Anna, and good afternoon, everyone. So countries have made significant progress in developing NDCs and long-term strategies. However, when it comes to moving from strategic planning to effective implementation, the real question becomes, how much will it cost and who will pay for it? So as you well know, there is a strong consensus on the fact that the transition will be costly, still less than the cost of inaction, of course, but this means that funding needs to be secured. So you may be aware of the estimates which were provided by Bhattacharya et al., saying that the additional spending needs for developing and emerging economies by 2030 will be around $1.8 trillion per year. So, and we argue at I4C that a critical element of the implementation of these long-term strategies is that countries developed a financing plan for the transition. So how could this help? So first of all, by providing an integrated perspective which would cover both mitigation and adaptation, climate and development, and a whole-of-economy approach, these financial plans would lay out the financial equation that countries are facing. But they would also go beyond a mere estimation of needs, and they would constitute a roadmap to bridge the finance gap. So they would make it easier actually to attract and channel funding where it is most needed, and they would also be more conducive to address transition. And by laying out short to medium-term public action, they would provide a clear signal to the private sector, which would increase the share of the private sector and improve the alignment of financial flows. And finally, they would limit the risk of a disorderly transition. We would end up being way more costly, mainly because of stranded assets and because of the risk of maladaptation. So what should these plans cover? So you'll see here on the chart that appears. So first of all, we believe that the first step would be to derive from long-term strategies or climate strategies an assessment of investment needs. So this is what some countries have been doing so far. This is what you heard in Abdulrasheed's presentation. And this is really the translation of projected real economy changes into sectoral climate investment needs. So this is the first step. The second step, so the box in blue, we called it policies and public spending. And this is where countries should try to figure out the policy mix to trigger these investments. So the mix of regulation, fiscal instruments, subsidies. And this would, of course, assume the role, some share of the private sector, and this would provide an estimate of the additional public spending needs. And in this box, or in this component, you could also, for instance, include the fact that fiscal revenue from fossil fuel taxes will also go down by 2030 as the transition moves forward. So for instance, in France, we had a recent estimate released by the French government that by 2030 we'll have 13 billion euros less in fiscal tax revenue. This is the second box. And then the next stage, so once you have your overall estimate of public spending needs, additional public spending needs, the question is which resources do you put in front of it? So this is where countries should engage on a reflection of how climate harmful expenditure could be redirected towards climate-friendly items, potentially considering revenue from new fiscal instruments, could be linked to carbon pricing, but not only. Also explore the potential to issue green bonds, to mobilize debt, to also mobilize multilateral development banks, other public development banks, the role of climate funds, so adaptation fund, green climate fund, and also potentially consider other sources such as revenues from international taxation or Article 6. So this is a financing component, the third one. And then, of course, because the transition will cover the whole of the economy and will transform actually all sectors, we also argue that there should be a component on the expected macroeconomic impacts of the transition. And we've done a literature review, and of course, I'm sure you know the macroeconomic variables which are expected to be affected by the transition. So, of course, prices, but also employment, debt, trade balance, and foreign exchange. So that's it. So this is what we argue for. We've developed a series of tools and analysis which are publicly available and to support countries in developing these financing plans. We've been very glad to see that here at the COP, actually many countries that have developed climate strategies are embarking on this pathway of developing financing plans, are moving towards starting with investment needs, but also thinking about the additional resources that they can mobilize. And maybe here I could mention the example of France. So last year, there was a creation of a General Secretariat for Ecological Planning in France, which sits right under the authority of the Prime Minister. And the director for the finance and budget was a speaker at one of the side events this week here at COP. And she said that their prime focus is to come up with a financing plan that is consistent, concrete, and credible. So, of course, there's no arguing that this is quite ambitious, but we see it as the only way to ensure the effective implementation of climate strategies. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. And I hand over directly to Aki.
Thank you. Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more that the definition of needs is anything but trivial. And I think it's very interesting that to observe the evolution of the understanding of needs and how dynamic that is, right? It's very normative, some of these estimates, and they're evolving very quickly. And I think it was not so long ago that supercritical coal, for example, was in green bond standards in some places. I think there's an emerging consensus that we need to be moving away from that. In the EU, more recently, we've had a big debate about what role gas should play in the EU taxonomy. What role does that play in terms of needs determinations and need estimates and costing? Increasingly, we have discussions on finance needs for a just social transition, And these things go way beyond what traditional understanding of mitigation and adaptation finance might have been, really not very long ago. And increasingly, we're also having more of a discussion on the need for transition finance. And while that's very vaguely defined, or there are many different definitions, increasingly we're also coming to the realization that we're going to need to be retiring a lot of the existing fossil fuel assets before the end of their useful technical lifetimes, and often before the end of their economic lifetimes. And that poses a question, what kind of transition do we want? What kind of transition, what does that transition look like? And it comes with new challenges, especially when we start to think about the potential idea of buying emitting sources in order to shut them down. This comes with moral hazard risks, where I think the investors who might be thinking about investing in emitting assets see less of a stranded asset risk because they believe they will be bought out, potentially by public finance down the road. That may delay the transition. They may reduce their own transition efforts in order to be paid more to reduce those assets. These are things that traditional definitions of finance, of climate finance, are struggling to grapple with. But I think in determining these need definitions, it's something that we are increasingly going to need to face in a number of contexts, in the private sector context, in the public sector context, in national budget negotiations, in the UNFCCC. And I think especially with these sort of vague or high-level promises of transition finance, it's very important to think about the key performance indicators that we want to be seeing and how fast those transition pathways are going to actually reduce, and how early is early, and what is the actual technical lifetime, could have been retrofitted, and are we actually risking financing business as usual with a transition or sustainable linked label. And this kind of, I mean, we don't talk about so much greenwashing in the UNFCCC. Greenwashing is mostly talked about in the private sector. But I think in determining and estimating these climate finance needs, we need to be very careful of how we think about transition finance and the incentives that we are setting with coming up with these pots of money that could potentially be pushing in the wrong direction or just kind of financing business as usual.
Thank you so much. Perfect. So as promised, we already start with an interactive part now. I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. We heard about basically from determining needs and costing them to a long-term transition path and investment plan to then what this transition all kind of entails, right, and what we have to think about. So please feel free. We have 2 microphones in the room somewhere. Are there any questions? Who wants to start this off? Yes. Maybe say to whom you want to address the question, or if it's to all of them.
Okay, so my question goes to Abdulrasheed. You mentioned already that we could speak more about the reasons why we have the differences, so maybe you could elaborate on that a bit more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to shortly check, is there another question in the room right now that we can... Otherwise, you can think about your questions and Abdulrasheed can answer and you listen at the same time. Please, Abdulrasheed.
Yeah. So I think I have to say a caveat before this, because we we read these NDCs and quantified what is in these NDCs, but we really cannot say exactly the motivations behind those numbers because those reasons lie with the countries. But as researchers, what we were thinking, so mitigation has reduced from 3 trillion to almost 2 trillion. What we made of this is that between first and updated NDCs, which is over 5-year periods, the cost of mitigation technologies has rapidly fallen. So if you look at the cost of solar or wind or electric vehicles, or these mitigation technologies has fallen, so perhaps that could explain why mitigation is lower. Another reason could be because, so 5 years has passed, so kind of the time frame to 2030 has reduced, so countries reduce estimates for mitigation. These are things that our hypothesis, we haven't tested them. Maybe we need to go to the field and ask. For adaptation, what we think of is that now we have better capabilities to estimate adaptation impacts of climate change, and this could be because of advancements in scientific modeling due to attribution or better damage functions, or now the IAM models. Whatever, now we have much better ones that are able to integrate uncertainties and provide better estimates. So we think this could explain why adaptation is higher. But if we even dig deeper behind these numbers, we find small island developing states where the countries with the highest estimates between first and updated NDCs, while most African countries reduced their estimates per capita, we find that small island developing states have really rapidly increased their needs, and that is usually for adaptation. So perhaps this could be the reasons behind that. Yeah.
Thank you, Abdulrasheed. Again, you have a question.
If you want me to wait until I'm on the panel, I don't.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah? I just feel obliged to respond to this. For most developing countries, you have your hands shackled behind your back, and sometimes you have your feet shackled as well. We come from a legacy of being organized to be economically less successful. This is the reality of colonization. We're also that place in the world that has such dramatic damage on the back of climate change that there isn't a prioritization that's easy. It's a very long list. So when someone like Axel van Tossenberg says that he's not getting the specificity and the concreteness on something that they have invested in imposing on the rest of the world, which is a high carbon economy, I think there's something seriously disingenuous about that. And we do have to deal with that elephant in the room. And we also have to examine our own envelopes of innovativeness. If we take the same climate formula that gave us this very powerful fossil fuel economy, is this now the same one that's going to organize ourselves into a lower carbon world that we all need? And then how do we balance this climate socialism that we're talking about in these hallowed halls against the fact that the competitiveness thinking, the competitiveness paradigm continues to dominate global economics? So I think there's a bunch of stuff here that is seriously either ignored or being left unsaid that we really need to engage. It'd be great to get your responses. Thank you.
Thank you. Who of you wants to?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you on your first comment or question. But for us, these financing plans are just the most pragmatic approach once a country has developed its own objectives. So it's really based on the needs identified by the country. And we're just saying the natural next step is to come up with a financing plan to be able to attract more funding and put it where it's most needed. And your second point is very good. Yeah, definitely the issue of the competitiveness paradigm. And also, so we definitely feel that there is a need for more collaboration across countries. So for instance, as we see at the moment in Europe, with the IRA, a lot of countries are trying to attract or retain their industry on their territories, but without thinking about the optimal way of having an industry which is compatible with the net zero objective by 2050. So we definitely see that there is, the focus is too much a bit maybe on competitiveness, and there is room for way more collaboration on the international and regional level.
Yeah, I mean, I think just a comment on the high carbon growth model that has been promoted, imposed or promoted on the rest of the world. I think and one issue is that we're also coming into an issue of a conflict of interest, because there's also debt that is associated with the construction of a lot of those emissive assets, and that debt is often still being repaid. And there's a conflict of interest if we shut those emissive assets down early. Is that debt going to be repaid? And I think that's another, it's a question of sort of historical responsibility of finance providers historically, and how we're going to navigate that as well.
It's definitely a question we can take up in the panel right afterwards, where we have two development banks present. There is time for one last question. Yes, please, here in the front.
Hi, Sarah Jane Ahmed from the V20 Secretariat. I know you were talking about moral hazard when we decide to finance out to shut down a fossil fuel plant, but in many developing countries, these are extremely expensive plants, and we have extremely long take-or-pay power purchase agreements where it's really a game of cost of capital. Like, do you see, because the Philippines did a purely private sector deal, shutting or closing a coal plant early and then funding the replacement purely based on cost of capital. Do you see any opportunities surfacing in other countries, in like Europe or other developing countries?
I think that's a longer discussion that we're writing a paper on right now with I4CE. I think that the models for independent power producers and the kind of take-or-pay contracts are going to be very different than for utility-owned coal plants. And I think that the approaches to shutting those down needs to look very different. But yeah, we can pick that up in more detail after this event.
Thank you. Does anyone of you? No? All right. So we now flip it around, basically. So beware the four panelists. Maybe those three are going to ask you questions afterwards too. But I'm happy we're perfectly in time, and I'm happy to welcome 4 panelists up here. And thanks to all of you. Please give them a hand. So, I'll wait until they're up here so that you can properly see them. All right. So now we're going to switch the perspectives a bit. We have 4 different perspectives, but still very much at the core of the topic. So we have Desigan Naidu. You heard him asking a question before. He's the head of climate adaptation at the South African Presidential Climate Commission and head of the African Climate Risk and Human Security Program at the Institute for Security Studies Africa. He's also president of the global NGO Human Right to Water and the founding member of the Water Policy Group, as well as member of various boards all around water management and governance, if I saw that correctly. We then have Sarah Jane Ahmed, serves as a finance advisor to the vulnerable group of 20 V20 ministers of finance of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. She is currently a member of the Task Force on Climate Development and the International Monetary Fund, a consortium of experts working to advance development-centered climate policy at the IMF. And she's also part of the advisory body or advisory boards of various institutions, including the Global Renewables Congress. We have Gareth Phillips. He's Chief Climate Change and Green Officer in the African Development Bank Environment and Climate Change Division. His background is in forestry and sustainable resource management, carbon market mechanisms, including CDM and GI, emission trading schemes, and in international climate negotiations. And then we have, as some kind of surprise guest, jumping in for Stefan Algat, we have David Groves, a lead climate change specialist in the World Bank's Climate Finance and Economics Unit. He co-leads the World Bank's global program on long-term low-emissions development strategies, and he provides analytical guidance for the World Bank's country climate and development reports. So I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion up here, and I want to ask Desigan to start, basically setting the scene from his country perspective and basically building on what you said, of course, before. Can you please share to what extent can and do countries have such a comprehensive view of their financing needs for the transition, and what does this imply?
Thank you. I'm aware that I am now going to be the receiving end of another comment.
Yes.
Well, closer? Yes? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for the opportunity. I think this is a really important thing to discuss. So, as a starting point, I mean, I do agree that countries and, if possible, sub-regions and regions need to organize their thinking around the plans and the prioritization. So in the case of South Africa, we have constituted our latest thinking on our climate finance landscape, and it's a very interesting story. Parts of it are very difficult. And then computing into the system the transition plan, and we have a just energy transition investment plan already composed. And as an extension, and something we're working on now, is to work out a just adaptation and resilience investment plan. And the word investment actually is really important in those. And within that, there are various levels of prioritization in that landscape, very little of which is now completely in consensus. A lot of it is in discussion, and it's stimulating the movements that we need to go to. But I think the thing that is absolutely key, and one of the learnings that we've had from our experience and the experience of the other African partners and Asian partners in particular that we are working with in the Global South, together with partnerships with the North, like the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, is that you've got to have a convergence between your energy transition, your broader climate transition, and the development trajectory in your systems. I mean, that convergence is absolutely key. It's key in many directions. One of those directions, and the one we would be talking about at this COP, at least I hope they are, in the negotiating rooms, is the possibility of maladaptation as people move to their SDG goals without getting sufficient finance assistance around organizing for climate-friendly interventions rather than maladaptation interventions. And I think this convergence is absolutely critical. The last point I'd like to make in this space is that all of this happens with a very big scepter in the background. And I want to raise this because it's not being spoken about enough. That if developing countries in particular, and maybe even one or two developed countries, are pushed far enough, they will have no choice but to use the fossil fuel assets at their disposal. I mean, right now, Africa is a 4% emitter. It has $10 trillion worth of fossil fuel assets sitting on its doorstep, and this is oil and gas at the current exploration knowledge as well as coal. If there is a need, if Africa is pushed sufficiently strongly to avoid a demographic burden of a very youthful continent, it will have to use that fossil fuel asset in order to keep poverty at bay, at which point Africa will go from being a 4% emitter to a 40% emitter. We won't be talking about 2 degrees as the upper bound anymore, we'll be talking about 6 or 7. So understanding that the climate finance project is in fact a global project for global dividend and to avoid global risk, I think is absolutely key. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Sarah, the V20 group is in a very special position, of course, both with regards to mitigation, but then even more so on adaptation and loss and damage. Can you share your perspective on what are the biggest challenges with defining and formulating these needs? And then, of course, also long-term strategies that come with that.
Thanks for the question. I think just going through the agenda of the V20, many countries are working on climate prosperity plans, and it's about how development and climate action go hand in hand, and they're not trade-offs. By maximizing development outcomes, adaptation, and resilience, developing countries can do more towards the 1.5 limit target. I think so. The challenges include costing data. It's really tough to find costing data on adaptation and resilience. National data, regional data. We have, there are examples of countries that have it, but they're too far out and too different. Cost of capital is different across the board as well, so this will factor in. So I think that would be quite important if those with the most experience with adaptation and resilience projects, the multilateral development banks, for example, could perhaps make available a database of costing data. That would be very useful. I think the second thing is when formulating the needs, it's sort of based on the existing financial architecture, which is out of touch with what we need in order to course correct this decade. And it's important that perhaps there's support and plans in place that are more focused on maybe the future financial architecture rather than the existing, because it will limit upfront investment as well as priorities, because a lot of climate action is capital intensive. And the current architecture, including debt sustainability analysis of the IMF and other things, don't really promote this investment need. It promotes austerity as opposed to an investment to reach debt sustainability. So I think with these two things sorted, it would be much easier then for countries to figure needs as well as the long-term strategy in a very precise manner. Because I saw the slide from the colleague from ETH on the costing data, and I think that whole thing is the huge opportunity that we could perhaps figure. And also this is important to do very soon, because as we reach the next decade or the new decade, we will have to make very difficult decisions. And the more we can do this decade, the less difficult those decisions will have to be.
Thank you so much. You basically gave the perfect entry to jump to the two finance perspectives. Gareth, I want to ask you, what do you see as the role of different actors, such as the IFIs, in the needs determination? Sarah mentioned the database of costing data, but do you have any best practice examples, or can you share any of your experiences with us?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for inviting me onto the panel. Thanks for the questions. So I think on determining the needs, indeed, MDBs have data. I think that's a good point. How useful that is for determining actual costs, I don't know, because we know that the costs of adaptation are very context specific. And very often, at least to date, a lot of our adaptation projects are combined with other activities. And if I kind of turn it around, we report on our climate finance data, and establishing the amount of climate finance in existing projects, once they're approved, we analyze them for adaptation mitigation, and to try to get a sort of more granular level of detail. And that's quite difficult to do. We have methodologies, but unless it's clearly 100% adaptation or 100% mitigation, then splitting up those costs and allocating them can be quite challenging. And then, of course, we have different financing costs for different kinds of activities. But I think the areas that we can look at to help identify the needs are really coming from the Paris Agreement documentation, the long-term strategies, the NDCs, the national adaptation plans. And in Africa in particular, we're still very much lacking on the long-term strategies. Only last time I looked, and maybe it's improved a little bit, but I think there were 4 countries had published long-term strategies. And so there's a real concern that the nationally determined contributions are not necessarily leading us to a low-carbon, climate-resilient future. It's a bit like, you're laying a path at the end of the garden, and the 5-year plans are the paving slabs. And if you don't have an overall map as how you get to the end of the garden, there's a risk that you're going to go off to the side and hit the fence. And that's kind of where we are. That's where I fear we are with the NDCs, because we lack the real direction. And so I was very interested in the figures from the first panel, to show how those had changed. And I think that's a very interesting area to look at, and to understand, are we going in the right direction with the NDCs and the national adaptation plans? Another area is that we're not good at identifying what adaptation is. I think that there's still a lot of uncertainty, a lot of activities that aren't necessarily identified as adaptation. And when you look at the money that countries, African countries in particular, are spending on disaster risk recovery, this is a form of adaptation expenditure, but it's not being reported as such. And if it were, it could help identify those costs in better relief. It could put into context the benefit of acting in advance and spending money ex ante on disaster avoidance, disaster planning and disaster management, rather than addressing it on an ex post basis. In terms of best practice, I want to mention the work that the MDBs are doing on creating the LTS program to mobilise funds to support countries in preparing Paris-aligned documentation. In the African Development Bank, we also have technical assistance for creating Paris documentation, also looking at subnational NDCs or determined contributions and subnational adaptation plans, which I think are going to be very important. Let me stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, David, the World Bank also works with countries throughout the world on their development and climate agendas, and including, of course, their climate finance agendas. So what observations do you have on and to these financing needs, and the approaches of how you can meet those needs that could be pursued?
Great. Great. Thank you, Anna, and thanks so much for having me on this panel. This is such an interesting topic, and there's so many different angles to approach it. But I think what I wanted to do just in a couple minutes is talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing at the World Bank to actually drill down in each country and unpack what the development and climate challenges are for that country. We do this through our country climate and development reports, or CCDRs, and as of this COP, we've...
I'm sorry, Dave, can you go a bit closer to the microphone, just so that... Yes,
yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry. As of this COP, we have completed CCDRs for 42 countries, representing about 2/3 of the non-high income country emissions. And so the real focus, or one of the focus of these reports, is to identify or describe what a low emissions resilient pathway would look like, and then identify what those investment needs and policy needs would be, really following the framework that was laid out by you in your talk. And so what we find is, of course, the needs are very high, over $500 million till 2030, and this is even on a low estimate compared to global estimates. But the thing that's, I think, particularly critical is that the investment needs are higher for those countries that are lower income and that have contributed least to the problem. So it's a 1 or 2% of GDP for middle and upper middle income countries, and closer to 8 to 10% for lower income countries. So obviously we have a huge challenge here in figuring out, well, how do we support get the financing and support these countries. So, MDB support is critical, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but obviously the private sector and mobilizing the private sector is key. So, in these CCDRs, we recognize that this is very context specific, and in some countries it's subsidies or it's policy reforms that need to be put in place to unlock that private financing. In other countries it's other issues, but one way that the MDBs can really support, in addition to, of course, direct lending or concessionary financing, is through helping improve the environment for that private financing. And so lastly, the MDBs are looking to develop new ways to support the financing in countries, and this includes blending finance approaches and hedging risks, and just we're just considering all sorts of options to expand this. So maybe I'll stop there, and then maybe next question I'll talk a little bit more about the LTS process.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So in this second round, I want to kind of look a little bit ahead, say I think even if it's not officially, agreed, but I think the global stocktake is very clear. It's too little and too slow, basically on every level, right? And now looking ahead, what we know from how we already identify some needs, but it's really, really difficult, and we have many questions still open, and knowing that we have to raise ambition and we have to become more capable of adapting and also reacting to losses and damages, I want to basically now ask what we need to do. I want to also give you the option to answer or to react to one of you. I want first just everyone to be able to speak once, but if you have something that you felt like you wanted to say or react to one of your statements, please do so. And then after this round, we're going to open up again and have questions from the audience if you have any. So I want to start this time with Sarah. Maybe can you tell us, we all know that the finance flows are really, really little, right? But can you tell us a bit which needs are maybe covered a little bit better or are covered while others not so much, and which ones would that be? And then also, sitting here now, what would countries like the ones from the V20 need from the different stakeholders to better cover these needs?
Thank you. I think that, depending on the country, but generally speaking, one is clearly losses and damages are just absorbed by countries or the most vulnerable communities and their enterprises. So protection finance is nowhere near the levels it needs to be. The second thing, I think, is adaptation funds, of course. The lack of adaptation is contributing to more losses and damages. So I think I agree with Gareth when he says that perhaps we are actually there are adaptation projects that may not be counted or considered, and maybe there are new infrastructure projects built today that don't have any resilience elements. And I think that from now on, we should ensure that all projects have a resilience element, that nothing should not be adapted. This includes the power system, in addition to the other sectors, agriculture, infrastructure, others. I think the other thing that is quite important is the composition of finance, just because debt levels are very high and debt is very expensive. Next year, the V20 group, 68 of them, the estimated debt servicing cost is $100 billion. So that's $100 billion not going to productive assets or other things. That's just going to debt payments. So I think moving forward, cost of capital, so local currency financing would be really important. Long-term financing from MDBs would be also quite critical. And also as we look to the transition, I'm just pulling up some data from the Sri Lanka Climate Prosperity Plan. They require about 26 billion this decade, so about 6.5 billion per year to successfully adapt and mitigate, according to the numbers that they have. That's a lot, and if we add that to the government's, let's say, balance sheet, that's not going to be possible. with the constraints that they have today. So I think that that's something that we need to figure how best we can structure these deals so governments can, one, still pay off debt, but two, be given breathing room to actually invest in adaptation, resilience, and the low carbon transition. And then the last point that I'd like to make is a lot of ministries have pipelines. Like there are projects that they have in their ministries, but they just need a little bit of support just to get that off the ground. It could be some sort of project preparation, a feasibility study. There are SMEs and corporates running around that could potentially participate in resilience building or insurance or prearranged funds or other things, but they need capitalization, and that capital is missing. So I think there's a lot of gaps here, but again, with the architecture reform hopefully underway and the MDBs clearly stepping up their lending as well as technical support, perhaps we'll come back next year and perhaps there are less gaps.
Let's see what we're going to talk about next year. That's we will note that. Desigan, how does, in your perspective, this currently still very insufficient financing influence kind of the update and the development of these strategies? And what is, in your eyes, also necessary if we say we need to increase ambition? What is necessary to happen now that we can step further?
Yeah, that's always a difficult question, and it relates to that prioritization thing. I think the first thing to appreciate is that this big word transition means different things in different places. So for the part of the world that I come from, it's not primarily about transforming a high carbon economy into a low carbon economy. It is a low carbon pathway to a developed economy, and it's quite different. It has some limitations because you're not just doing a direct transition in the traditional sense. It has opportunity because you're talking about an investment regime that goes along with new infrastructure. So our quest around the energy transition is the quest for energy security, and energy security on the back of renewable energy as a preferred option to that which is not, and it's a bun fight that continues. The second thing I want to point out is that it gives us an opportunity to really contextualize the CRDP context, that the climate resilient development pathways are now being embedded into our national planning systems. And hopefully this will take root. But we are learning from everywhere else, and every bit of data helps. I mean, the CCDR that you spoke about was invaluable to South Africa's own discussion. And it brought many of the stakeholders together, even if it was primarily to disagree with the World Bank data. But we're developing out now, a convergence that really matters. And then maybe the last thing to put into the pot, because we must have the space for people to challenge us back, is this whole issue around the localized reform of the financial architecture. Yes, the global financial architecture desperately needs to be a lot different than it currently is. But you have to stimulate that local movement as well. And some of that is already beginning. And if you get that architecture right, then you've got that investment into the long term. And then banking on the things that don't take too much money in the short term that will serve you well in the long term, like climate information services, also come into that fray. So it is difficult, but it is the right discussion.
A new infrastructure, the priorities are different, right, among different stakeholders and among different countries as well. Gareth, how can these stakeholders ensure that climate finance flows actually really kind of are aligned with the priorities of developing countries? The very easy question, I know, too.
So, well, thank you very much. I think the first point to make is that, well, particularly for the MDBs, I think that the DFIs, but the MDBs in particular, we are demand-driven institutions, so we respond to what our host countries ask us for. our regional member countries ask for. So if they want to spend their ADF money on infrastructure, energy systems, transmission, then that's what we spend the money on, and we then work to mobilise additional finance to co-finance those, to reduce the costs and so on. And if those are Paris-aligned activities that are contributing to this low carbon climate resilient development pathway, and if they are just as well, which is very important to remember, then there's no reason, well, apart from the general lack of money, but these activities should be possible to be funded. So I think the Paris alignment is a key component of ensuring that these activities are the correct ones to be doing. And Paris alignment, and particularly Article 2.1c, which calls for all financial flows to be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, this will become increasingly important because it will mean it's not just MDB finance, but it will be all forms of finance coming into projects from DFIs and from commercial sources as well. So I think that will help a lot in ensuring that it's the right kinds of projects that go forward. I think a couple of other initiatives, we have the country platforms, which we're now agreeing amongst the MDBs. We're going to work together. And I think they build on the CCDRs from the World Bank. And we see more agreement for coherence and convergence amongst the main funds. We can see a time when the MDBs will come together on platforms and work together to achieve programmatic initiatives and so on. So that will increase the opportunity for stakeholder consultation. Just transition is also critical. Just transition is, really, I think of it as a little bit like stakeholder consultation on steroids. You've just got to do far more stakeholder consultation. And in the African context, it's very interesting because traditionally, just transition is about protecting jobs for people in dirty environment, in polluting jobs, to ensure that they have good jobs as you move to clean technology. And that works in fossil-fueled economies, particularly South Africa, where we see 40,000 workers in ESCOM who are going to need to be transitioned. 15,000 of those are in the generation sector. But in the majority of African countries that are not fossil-fuel development, they don't have those jobs in the first instance. So actually, the stakeholder consultation has to be about identifying who is being impacted by projects and who are the beneficiaries and who are the losers, and making sure that those people who are on the losing side are not overlooked and that actually they are found ways to improve. And that's going to be a big component of ensuring that the activities that we do are speaking to the last thing. And my final point is that as we work on the demand to meet projects, it's really important that our national development plans, so the country's national development plans, the NDCs, long-term strategies, and the banks. In the African Development Bank, we call them country strategy papers. I know the other MDBs have similar. They're 5-year plans as to what they're going to prioritise. All of these need to align and make sure that we're talking about the same things. We can't have national development plans that say we're going to develop fossil fuels, NDCs that say we're going to renewable energy, and then the bank somehow caught in between. So I think those are some of the points that we have. And I mentioned one other initiative that we're working on at the African Development Bank is creating green banks as national financing institutions that can support local and national and subnational financing requirements in both hard and soft currency. I think these are the kinds of institutions that can also help to meet demand, stakeholder demand, ensure the money is put in the right place. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to take this up on that they all need to be aligned. David, maybe you can elaborate or think, share a bit your thoughts on how let's say the whole MDB community together can then kind of build on these different documents, on the NDCs, on the long-term strategies, on the development strategies to work towards this implementation.
Sure, thank you. First of all, it's a really interesting discussion. I'd like to, build a little bit on Gareth, what you're saying in terms of, what is the role of the MDBs and in supporting green development? So, without a doubt, in the past, the MDBs have supported higher emissions type of development that we see in place right now, which we're of course now working towards to transition away from. But as Gareth highlights, MDBs are demand driven, and so really I think our role in ensuring that is to ensure that the type of support that we provide is fully aligned with Paris, and this is where the MDBs have been really working hard together, and I think we're all basically committing mostly to be fully Paris aligned, meaning our support is consistent with this low carbon resilient transition. It does point to there's some simple heuristics that can be developed to help guide that, but really we need to understand in each country what does that look like, because developing countries, as was mentioned, it's less about decarbonizing an economy and more just aligning its development that it must pursue along a low carbon trajectory. So there's those needs versus maybe a middle income country, which requires shifting its energy system away towards renewables, for instance. So that has to happen at a country by country level. It's really difficult to come up with some high level broad guidance for that, and that's really where these different activities like CCDRs, of course, but those are more bank documents, but how we can develop, then need to develop things like long-term strategies. And for those of you who aren't that familiar with long-term strategies, it's a country-owned document. It's a process to work directly with the ministries of a country to provide assistance to them, to help them elaborate how they think they can develop in a way that will meet the climate goals, but also maximize their development opportunities. And fortunately, we're facing times where there's real alignment in that once you can get over the financing hurdle. So that I think provides sort of our mandate is to help countries develop these long-term strategies to make sure that their NDCs are actually going towards the gap in the fence and not running into the fence, and then also supporting overcoming the financing needs. So I guess Gareth mentioned that the MDBs are really working to scale up how much support we can provide to countries in developing their long-term strategies. So we have a joint program that we're actively fundraising for, which will help us coordinate better and really help fill in that gap in areas like Africa, but also throughout the world where the countries just haven't yet had the opportunity or the resources to develop these long-term strategies. So that's something that by next year I'm really hopeful we'll be able to report that we made good progress on that. And then maybe one last point that comes out of our CCDR work is that there's a lot of the challenges in this transition isn't just financing, it's also helping countries be and their governments be prepared and have the capabilities to enact this transition. And so on adaptation and resilience, we've been experimenting and developing new tools to help assess, well, what do governments need to be able to effectuate the transition, to a more resilient future. And so we've got, different instruments to help understand where different countries need support. And then that's a real area where we can, with modest amount of funding, provide a lot of benefit that can then unlock, the ability for a country to improve its resilience. And they're similar, I think the LTS process really can help on the mitigation side in a similar way. So maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Designate, I saw you taking lots of notes. Do you want to react to it, or you were just taking notes?
Trying to get a debate going.
but maybe we should take the
all right. So, as promised, I already see a hand. That's great. Again, I would suggest we have one question. Are there more questions, right? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's take these 3 questions. Please, again, state to whom you want to direct them, or if it's to all of the speakers. I'll try to make sure that I note this down. Try to keep your questions rather short so that we have enough time, and then we make a second round where we, maybe this side also wants to ask questions. Exactly, but please.
Yeah. May I come back to the question of debt? Mm-hmm. And maybe the question is directed to Sarah, since she's so close to the IMF and G20. You mentioned also, Sarah, that the debt is, obviously very high in developing countries, and that the marge de maneuver, actually, to do all this work that we have to do, is very slim. So maybe it's time to discuss the debt issue like we had it 30 years ago. Debt reduction programs, debt for environment swaps, including the moral hazard that might imply. What are your thoughts about these? Is there a discussion going on, Sarah?
Thank you. Then we have a question from Diane and then from Abdulrasheed.
Yes, I think
Diana.
I will just complement the question because it was going in the same direction, and it was also to Sarah. Because you were talking about the future financial architecture. And so I wonder how you envision that future financial architecture, considering not only debt swaps, but maybe going back with a historical perspective to the very creation of Bretton Woods institution, which then created somehow the whole ecosystem we have, and not only because then we have the other private side. Then it gets more complex. But maybe just staying with Bretton Woods and thinking about a call for instance, for SDRs to be used more, thinking on the IMF. How do you see all the different non-debt creating debt-based instruments that could come out to help us finance the transition?
Thank you, Diana. Abdulrasheed?
Yeah, my question is to David. And sorry, my name is Abdulrasheed Issah. And the question is, so you estimate needs in CCDRs. Could you tell us more how you do that, what methodologies you do, and to which time frame? Is it to 2030? Is it uniform across all countries, or for each country is a different method? And another thing is, when you mention the long-term plans and NDCs and all that with different estimates, how do we make sure there is no double counting? So for example, if you try to take numbers from NDC, from the adaptation plan, from long-term strategies, and you add these numbers, there is likelihood that you will get double counting and overestimate the climate finance needs. And how could that be addressed? Or are you thinking of something, a uniform approach to tackle that? Thank you.
Thank you. Who of you? Sarah, do you want to start?
Yes, thanks for the question on debt. So the V20 shared the Accra to Marrakesh agenda in October, but it was also circulating before that. But one of the pillars is make debt work for climate. And I think that illustrates the aims and the advocacy of the group around cost of capital, long-term debt, but also that debt burdens are so high, and the pandemic, the pause pretty much of the economy, but then you still have to pay your debt. Climate impacts, the V20 countries have lost 20% of wealth over the last 2 decades. So having 20% more in the bank account makes a big difference. So with that, I think perhaps there should be an opportunity to discuss the prospect of having a HIPC-style way forward to open up space, fiscal space, for investments. I mean, we need to address the fiscal space issue. And on top of that, I think there's been a lot of work done, like the World Bank coming in on the climate resilient debt clauses for pausing debt when climate disasters strike, at least new debt. But it would be important that it also includes old debt. The other point is around the debt sustainability analysis. I think that's actually a critical element because a couple of things are wrong with it. One is it doesn't necessarily differentiate whether you're making a climate investment or a business as usual non-adapted, non-resilient investment in your debt sustainability analysis. What you invest in makes a big difference on whether that is sustainable or whether it's highly risky. So the debt sustainability analysis needs a bit of reform in that sense, and also that it needs to really illustrate the true investment needs of the country so that when there's any restructuring, the haircut is should be likely a lot more than what we're getting today. Yeah, so I think there needs to be this discussion to figure how we create fiscal space, whether that is relief or something else, or a swap or whatever it is, that needs to come in. The other thing is, I think as we do this, as we make this transition, revenue lines are impacted. Countries that are importers of fossil fuels will pull a tax revenue from the fossil fuel imports, and that needs to be replaced. For the case of Sri Lanka, we see that their VAT, it's at 18%. When they switch to renewables, they will pull more tax revenue. But not all countries are like that. And so there needs to also be revenue replacement, at least for 2 to 3 years or more, as countries transition their economies, just so that we have sustainable cash flows for the macro sustainable debt that will have to take place in order to fund this transition.
Thank you. There is the question on the financial architecture, but
Right.
I don't know if you both want to answer to that, or Designate, if you want to start. I would also like to hear actually at least one of the banks then answering this question, but please, Designate, do you want to go ahead, and then Sarah, and then...
Sure. The first thing I want to put on the table is and extending from this point that Sarah made, is that there's the old debt crisis and new debt crises that are coming up. And just to say that the Sri Lankan example already has a counterpart in South Africa, because local authorities used to rely for a reasonable and very significant percentage of their revenue on reselling electricity from the national utility, which is primarily coal-sourced, although there is some nuclear. And the rapid replacement with rooftop solar in many municipalities means that the municipalities are now developing a financial crisis pretty rapidly. So there is a new debt crisis as well that has to come into the equation. The second thing I want to put into the plate is that, just to emphasize the point that I made before, is that if we aren't able to use what is a global crisis to develop out the local architectures of solutions, then we're losing the opportunity that the crisis is giving us. So our financial discussion at a national level in South Africa is now very different from what it was 2 or 3 years ago. The concept we talk about is an interesting South African word that says toenadering, which kind of means people coming closer together, and folk who've never done so. So the private-public dialogue around the restructuring of financial systems is actually vibrant currently, and very positively so. We don't know what the result's going to be, because people want to maintain their particular competitiveness. And the responsiveness of the National Treasury as a major discussant is something that's new and unique for us. And we have to thank the likes of the World Bank for putting the CCDR up there, because it gave us something to talk about together. So all of which means that there is a movement around it. But I have to say, the promise that came at COP26 on the back of the Bridgetown Initiative seems to have lost its momentum along the way. I mean, it's not been discussed with any vibrancy right here, 2 COPs later. And it's starting to sound like something we need to rescue. Let me pause there.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to add something?
Just on the question on the Bretton Woods institutions, I think the SDR rechanneling is quite important, because it then bolsters the development bank's lending opportunities. I think there needs to be more risk sharing. I think the banks need to take more risk. And I know that's a challenge to business as usual and you know the inertias that are in place, but we need more risk taking, and countries should not be the ones taking all the risk, but rather could we find some ways to, you know, if it's guarantees or if it's balance sheet sharing, that would be quite useful. Early stage financing, equity-like tools. I think we need to really get some financial engineers to come through to support with how we can structure this. We know what should be funded, but we need to figure how to make sure that it's sustainable for countries, and also brings in private sector, but private sector that's willing to stay and invest and not just, you know, be a short-term investor, but actually looking to partner and stay in the country. I think I'll stop there and maybe pass on to...
Wonderful, thank you. Maybe Gareth, you want to take over, and then in the end...
Yeah, I'd just like to come in on a couple of points there. On the banks taking the risk, I agree. You know, we should become more risky. On the other hand, protecting our AAA rating is critically important, because if we lose that, then the cost of our debt goes up. Which maybe points or brings into the conversation the rating agencies and the role that they have. And we know in the African context, you know, there's this concept of perceived risk, which just pushes the ratings down and increases the cost of debt for African countries. And, you know, the data is clear. The default rates on infrastructure projects are lower than the default rates in Africa, are lower than those in South America. And yet we have this burden placed on African countries. And secondly, on the climate resilient debt clauses, I think these are very interesting, but it's also important to note that as they currently sit, they are NPV neutral. So it simply means that you get a break in paying back the debt, but you've got to catch up afterwards. And I think that's a mistake. I think they should cancel the debt payments during the period of disaster and not add it on afterwards, because you know, then we're just making it harder. So I'd like to see that happening, but it's not in my decision-making tray to influence that. So others, please take that forward. Thanks.
We will take notes. David, do you want to also add to that, and then maybe go to the methodological question by Abdulrasheed?
Yeah, maybe I'll leave the debt there. I mean, okay. I agree with what was just said, and don't have much to add there. But I can address the question around the estimation of financing needs. So within the CCDRs, it is a very country-specific estimation. So each country team has used different methodologies and different models depending on, obviously, across the sector. But you know, essentially, it's so the estimate that comes out, I guess, the estimate that comes out is indicative. It's not really designed as, you know, to come up with the, you know, total investment need globally, but rather what we find is that when we add up the individual country-specific estimates using the best data and best tools available, it's in the ballpark. And I think that's important to highlight that that's probably fine for the purposes of what the CCDRs are designed for. You know, is it 500 billion or 1.5 trillion investment need by 2030? I don't think it really matters too much. What really matters is that for country X, Y, or Z, what are their needs? And now let's transition into, you know, moving from estimating, you know, cost to developing a project pipeline, and there you're going to eliminate the double counting concerns, and it's going to be much more concrete. It's like, how do you finance these projects? What share of it is public, concessional, private, et cetera? And that's really what matters the most. And this is just one more complement, or these estimates are really just one more to add to the mix. But in general, I think we're all seeing the same amount of investment needs, which is a very large number, which is going to have to be met in large part through the private sector. And once we unlock that, then it matters a little less what the actual number is.
Thank you. So we have time for maybe one or two short questions. Yes, I see one hand there. One more hand there. Okay. Again, please say to whom you want to direct the question, and then we're going to have a short answer round, and then we're already getting towards the end.
Thank you very much. My question could apply to all panelists, so I'll let them choose. So the situation is quite different for developed and developing economies, where in developed countries, you can see how the funding gap could be resolved through a bit more debt, a couple of new fiscal instruments, and potentially the redirection of climate harmful expenditure towards climate friendly expenditure. But the situation is quite different for developing and emerging economies, where there is a real shortfall due to increased adaptation costs and also the lack of fiscal space and the pressure on debt. So how do you see this shortfall being resolved? What are the main sources of funding that can be mobilized? Thanks.
Thank you. And then a question there in the front.
Yes, thank you. My name is Martin Holzer from the German Institute for Development Evaluation. So we do evaluation of all German ODA and especially also its climate-related funding. And Germany is one of the main donor for climate finance internationally, 4 to 6 billion euros a year, and half of it for adaptation, half of it for mitigation. And thank you for sharing your reflections with regard to needs. And my question is, one need I haven't heard so far too strongly is actually the need for the beneficiaries for having impactful activities financed by the finance provided. And I would be curious, how do you see the matter of impact in distributing finance based, of course, on the priorities and objective status in the NDCs and the NUPs and etc., but I don't learn anything about impacts in those documents. So what kind of information do we need, or are you already using to really identify the needs that have the most impact? And I'm saying that because we just closed an evaluation on adaptation, and we found of German adaptation-related funding, only 1/5 of the project and programs funded we have certainty about effectiveness and impacts, and for 4/5 we don't know anything about it. It can be positive, but not necessarily, so that's why I would be curious to hear from you something about that.
Thank you. So the question of impact and the question of the shortfall. Yes, please.
I just want to jump in on the impact one,
Please.
because this is a topic that we've been discussing a lot at this COP. One of the things that the MDBs and the World Bank has been focused on of late is really thinking about how do we augment our measures of impact from just a climate finance input. So how much are we spending on climate actions, to what are the outcomes or actual results from that spending. So one of the things that we've been beginning to work with the other MDBs is coming up with a common results framework to develop a set of indicators that we can collectively use as the MDB community, so that we can say more than X billions of dollars of climate finance, and instead or in addition, talk about what the impacts on emissions are, what the impact is on aligning with the transition, what about the gains in resilience. And so this framework is out, something that we are going to be working over a lot over the next 6 months or so to come back in order to basically answer that question, have the means within our banks to report on ex ante what we think our benefits are, and then over time shift to an approach where we're actually measuring ex post what the climate results are. And the goal is that with by measuring by measuring the impact, then we can finance it, right? And it can drive better finance decisions.
Thank you. Desigan?
Yes, thank you. So on the question about impact, there is right now, a very practical example playing itself out. This is what you, as Germany, call Just SA as the project, and what we call as a chapter of the JET IP in South Africa. That's in Mpumalanga province, and that's the transition of the coal belts into a low carbon belt with that transition. And I think that inside that project, well, it's a series of projects and it's more like a program, we are building in a fair amount of effort into working out the indicator sets that matter. And not just the indicator sets, but also the algorithms that eventually will get us to that impact narrative. Because some of it's going to be short-term, very little of it, frankly, and much of it long-term, integrated with a range of other factors that we spoke about a little bit earlier. So I think we're going to get a little bit clearer about where that goes in a little while. The second thing I want to react to is this issue around what is the resolution for the debt? And not being an economist, I don't have to be practical, so this is cool. Some of these discussions are straightforward within the template of balance sheets, and some of it's a lot more complicated but badly needed, like the discussion about what the origins of debt are. And it's quite interesting that Mia Motley and Prince Charles had a very public conversation here at the COP on reparations. I think that blends right into this discussion. Things like illicit flow of finances, like out of the African continent, for example. So we've got to have a pretty honest analysis of what the origins of debt are, and then work out who's responsible for what. Because we're taking it as a given that what currently exists in the balance sheet has to be honored. And developing countries currently are not powerful enough to challenge that. But I think we've got to dig a little bit deeper. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So looking at the time, I think we kind of have to wrap up. Sarah, Gareth, do you want to react to one of these questions shortly? Please.
Maybe just a quick one on where the capital could come from. So I know perhaps by spring 2024, the MDB management could formulate plans for a general capital increase. And they could also articulate how the increase will support climate vulnerable economies on development positive climate action.
Thanks. Let me just come in on the shortfall as well. In my view, I think consumers in the developed world, in the global north, are getting a free ride on adaptation. They contribute quite significantly towards cost of mitigation. We've got lots of voluntary targets. We've got emissions trading schemes and payments for emissions and so on. But no government is consistently collecting funds to contribute towards the cost of adaptation. And, you know, when you look at the global climate finance landscape, 95% of finance is going to mitigation and 5% to adaptation. And then you see that we need to scale up our total amount of climate finance. And on the background, parties committed to seeking to balance investment in adaptation and mitigation. So it's quite clear we need to collect more money for adaptation. And as consumers, there is a cost for every ton of CO2 that we emit to the atmosphere. Cost to mitigate it, but there is also an adaptation cost associated with that. And nobody is paying anything for that. And, you know, I'm sorry to propose an additional tax, but we need to cough up and start paying for that because it's having an impact upon lives of people in Africa and other developing countries.
Thank you so much. So we are at the very end of our panel. Thank you all for joining. I want to give our speakers the possibility to give one closing message, one only sentence that you want all of us to take with us and maybe remember next year at the COP. What is the message that you want to give? We can start over there and then go through maybe.
All right. I think my message is, you know, solving this problem is really going to require, collaboration and dialogue, and that is internally, within a country, within its ministries, with MDBs, with civil society, with the NGO community, and we need to really build on the momentum of these country-level discussions and engagements. Thank you.
Yes, the notion that we'd like to promote is this notion of climate Ubuntu. It's an African concept of I am because we are, and understand what that dependency means, and actually organize ourselves to use every instrument available to us, including an examination of climate finance as an expression of positive global solidarity, because without it, we're all stuffed together in the same boat.
Thank you. Sarah?
I think as we look at the debates going on here at the COP, important that it's linked to the G20 discussions, just because so much of the debt discussions and the reform could be supported by the G20.
Thank you. Gareth?
Great. I think some super points there. I think my takeaway is that adaptation finance is the elephant in the room.
Wonderful. And with that, I thank you all the panelists. Let's give them a big clap. Thank you all for joining, and let's wish us all a good outcome of this COP and see you again soon. Thank you.